Hey guys, it's Drake, and here to bring you another book recommendation today. And today, the recommendation will be Artorias by John Heath-Stubbs. So, I wasn't familiar with John Heath-Stubbs until relatively recently, around the last year or so. I found out about him. He's an English poet, born in 1918, so that makes him almost two generations younger than the majority of modernists, like James Joyce, T.S. Eliot. They were born in the 1880s, and then some were born a little later. But yeah, so he's two generations later, born after World War I. So he's in a different cultural worldview than many of my favorite writers, though not all. Some of my favorites were also born later, but one of the things I appreciate most is that from telling when he was born, you couldn't predict his style. And a couple things I touch on in here will be important with that. But so what's the background of the book? So Artorias, as you can imagine, is about King Arthur. But interestingly, he didn't try to modernize King Arthur like what usually happens, in the way that Shakespeare modernized his Roman plays and his historical English plays in a way. John Heath-Stubbs tried to do justice to the history or the historical reality of Artorias, or King Arthur. So I think it's important again to touch on John Heath-Stubbs and his growth as an artist. Came from a wealthy family, and so as he was educated, he went to good schools, and he was actually friends with Sidney Keys, who is a British World War II poet who did die in World War II. But later on, John Heath-Stubbs kept up with literary people, so like T.S. Eliot. He was familiar with T.S. Eliot. I believe they corresponded with each other. And very broad knowledge of the English language. I think that was one of the quotes of one of his friends, that he was one of the most accomplished scholars of English in the sense of the literature and the language throughout its history. And that is something that shows up very strongly in Artorias. So he wrote, lyric poems and shorter poems early on, published a few selections, and mainly the 1950s, I think, is when he really started getting going, 1940s, 50s. And then Artorias was published in 1974. So he was already, about 50 years old, 55 years old. And as far as I can tell, Artorias is his major work. That's what he really put his effort into. But like I said, he tried to do justice to the historical reality of who King Arthur might have been. And there are several different problems encapsulated in that, because King Arthur doesn't really show up until at least 500 years after he was supposed to have existed. The first real main exposition of who King Arthur was is in Geoffrey of Monmouth, his Latin history of England that was published around, can't remember the exact dates, but it's like from 1000 to 1100. I can't remember, it's closer to 1100, I think, AD. But that would have been at least 500 years after people think King Arthur existed. He probably existed in the 500s at some point, earlier 500s. And he's mostly known for his Battle of Baldon Hill. And Gildas, who was a scholar alive at that time, would have been in living memory of that battle, doesn't mention King Arthur or anyone with that name, but he does mention the battle. So it makes you believe that either Gildas didn't know the battle very well, or King Arthur wasn't King Arthur at that time. He became King Arthur later, which is, in my opinion, probably the most likely. And interestingly enough, there is a chapter, not really a chapter, but a section of this poem, Artorias, that is in the voice of a scholar. Now, that brings me to one of the more interesting parts of this. And John Heath-Stubbs is very influenced by, I would submit, James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, even though he comes about, 2 decades after, or 2 generations after, 4 decades after. So the poem starts as kind of a chorus or an introduction in the way that Goethe's Faust has, the ancient Greek plays. They kind of give you a rundown of what the poem's going to be about. And it is told in an alliterative meter, not a syllabic meter. So it starts with 3 instances of alliteration per line. And of course, like any meter, it varies slightly, but you'll always have, 3 instances of alliteration per line in that first section. And it's told in a more like heightened, maybe archaic style. And I noticed generally like Germanic roots, I guess you could say. Though not like only, like it's not like, I think Geoffrey Hill is kind of known for his strict Anglo-Saxon lexicon, but John Heath-Stubbs doesn't stick to that quite as strongly as I've heard Geoffrey Hill does. But anyway, so it starts in this heightened kind of chorus, mythological almost style. And then it continues in that way. It goes to a narrative of Artorias, and then it varies. So like I was mentioning, it goes to a modern day scholar, and that's just a part of the poem. It assumes the guise of a modern day scholar. And this scholar goes through the history of King Arthur and the historical reality of King Arthur, what he ended up being mythologically, almost like maybe a modern day superhero, a Marvel movie, how it starts out as some kind of children's comic and then it ends up being, billion-dollar grossing movies. Seems to be kind of a similar situation where, King Arthur was relatively minor as a figure, an interesting story that Geoffrey of Monmouth kind of blew up. And then it just grew and grew in subsequent centuries. And then, today we have movies, which he obviously doesn't mention there because this was from 74, but he does go through the possibilities of the historical person of Arthur, which could have been a late Roman, British general, which is where you get Artorias. He could have been a Welsh count or a Welsh royalty, and those seem to be the 2 most likely from the mid 200s AD to the early 500s AD is kind of like the reasonable time, or it could have been a merging of 2 people, which I think is basically what the conclusion that this scholar comes to. But anyway, so that's one of the interesting facets of this, is that it is polystylistic, kind of like Ulysses by Joyce. It varies its language while changing its style and its perspective. But I will say my favorite parts were the historical parts. And in that way, I want to read you one. So this is from the first section where you get introduced to the main characters being Artorias. And then there are 2 poets, or I don't know if they would have been called makers at this time, but they eventually would have been probably something like that, like court poets. And one is called Degrafen, don't know if I'm saying that right, and then the other one, the main one, is Gwayan. So this is from This is Gwion thinking to himself as you're getting introduced to the main characters. Musing, Gwion muttered into his mustache, "We evoke an order, an interim is assigned, as a poet perhaps in the future predicament, of the doubtfulness and dullness of a third dark age, might undertake the unfashionable inditing of an epic. Though his colleagues and his confreres confined themselves merely to little linguistic and logical constructs, or deployed their egos in the Dionysiac delirium of surreal illumination or psychedelic self-indulgence, he might establish an order by the example of this experiment, driving this through road across the thickets of thoughtlessness, and he also, if temporarily, might turn the tide, but they come back again, those currents of meaninglessness. Language lags and languishes away, the daughter of chaos reconsolidates her reign, universal darkness, and delivers it to the dunces." And that is basically John Heath-Stubbs' Ars Poetica, I think, for his whole life, basically, but especially noticeable in this work. And I do really appreciate that, because whenever I started reading contemporary poetry, some of it I loved, especially modernism. But as you start going later and later, you start getting people, unfortunately the stereotype is true, it's people who don't know anything about poetry creating prose and then adding arbitrary line breaks, all lowercase, totally misunderstanding what E. Cummings was doing, and so on. And it's almost the idea that everyone is equally bad. No one can actually be good because no one's trying. And I've always been completely disconnected from that logic. I just think it leads nowhere. Leads in pretty much meaninglessness, where no one can talk about anything apart from themselves, which, how interesting can that be? So I really appreciated seeing that in Heath-Stubbs. And another thing he does, tying back to what I just said, is that he's not afraid to step out of his own mind. And one kind of funny thing is Gwion and de Graffin encounter a scholar from their own time, and he's a critic. He knows everything about poetry, and he knows how it should be done. And he's exclaiming to his tadpoles in the water what poetry should be. And Gwion and de Graffin listen to this and are like, what are you talking about? And then he says, well, who are you? And then they say, well, we're poets. And then he says, well, what makes you a poet? And then Gwion goes on this long kind of Whitmanian monologue about how he is a poet because he was there at the birth of Christ. He was there when Julius Caesar was assassinated. And that gets me into one of the other, I think I'll end it here, the last major point that I really loved about this poem is that, appropriate for its time, it tried to encounter and deal with the three major strands of mythology and worldview that were coinciding in England at the time. So really about the 500s, you have the Germanic mythology that was native to England after it replaced Celtic mythology largely. But then interestingly, because Artorius might have been a Welsh nobleman, you do get that Celtic mythology that's still around, like the Druids and things that are still there. And along with that, you have the influence of Christianity, which in England started pretty early compared to other places in Europe, like where the Vikings were from. Up north, it didn't really happen until about the year 1000. So England and Ireland were relatively early compared to that. So you have, especially these two poets, competent in all three of these different colliding mythologies. And I've been especially interested in like Indo-European linguistics and mythology, but also like trying to find similarities in world mythology and how they change. I just recently read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and in there you get to see the creation of a mixture of religions or mythologies with the ghost dance religion, which was effectively an implantation of Christianity and the sacrifice ritual and the resurrection mythology into Native American belief systems, which I think is just fascinating to see it. Of course, the circumstances that led up to that were, in the very least, not worth the creation of that new mythology that died out. But it is interesting to see that happen at the same time, because inevitably that same thing happened whenever the Christians came in and saved a little but tried to destroy as much of the native mythology that existed in the regions that Christianity conquered, let alone what happened in the 15 and 1600s when Spain decimated whole cultural traditions in the New World. But I think they just kind of aligned with my current interests, and I loved seeing him kind of grapple with that, how that would have happened, because of course, after colonization happened in the 1600s, you have Eastern religions be massive influences in Western thought become a huge influence in Eastern thought and New World thought, and then you get a whole just global intermixing of so many things that it's almost like the most extreme cultural intermixing you could imagine, which of course has its positives and negatives. But I just thought it was interesting that John Heath-Stubbs picked a time that had this kind of similar intermixing, and he had his characters kind of struggle with it and deal with it. So anyway, I would highly recommend it. This is out of print technically, but it's relatively easy to get because it had multiple print runs. So I'd highly recommend grabbing a copy if you like 20th century long poems or epic poems. Add this to your list, and I think it follows really nicely in the tradition of, let's say, Robert Browning, Herman Melville with Sordello and Clairol, and then you have, let's say, Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock, The Wasteland, Ulysses, and even, interestingly enough, Finnegan's Wake, and kind of continues in that tradition. It's clear that Heath-Stubbs had most likely read all of those. Maybe discounting Clairol, I'm not sure if he had read that, but everything else he had certainly read. So you can see little hints and allusions throughout the whole poem, and it's just fun to encounter something that has such deep culture in it that you can always look for something new every time you reread it. So anyway, hope you enjoyed. Thanks again to all my Patreon supporters. I am very grateful, and hope you enjoyed this one. There will be more coming. Death is a gang boss.